Next item.
Item 9E, adopt resolution authorizing an increase in fines for parking violations defined in the California Vehicle Code and the San Bruno Municipal Code.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, this report and the analysis that was provided responds to specific requests by the City Council and by the City Council's Revenue Subcommittee to consider parking fines as a revenue strategy as well as a means by which the city might better enforce parking violations. The data was collected and the majority of the analysis was provided by the police department, and the police chief is here to deliver a more substantive report. As I mentioned, this item was a joint effort of our offices, and part of the consideration that I'd like you to understand tonight is that the recommendation is really based on, for a very modest increase in most of our parking fines, is really based on the analysis for existing costs of providing or making parking citation, enforcing parking violations and processing parking citations through our outside vendor. The police department does not typically utilize, and their mission is not to raise revenue per se. Their mission is to enforce violations. So I would suggest that the council be mindful of the fact that our analysis is really limited to, and the recommendations so far have been limited to cost recovery of existing costs associated with both enforcement as well as processing. The City Council, as you'll hear further in the report and is addressed in the written report, the City Council retains the authority to increase most of these parking fines by as much or as up to as much as $100 per, based on state codes. But that discretion lays with the City Council, and we're happy to take any additional direction from the City Council with respect to revenue generation from parking fines, as well as additional enforcement strategies associated with violations that are of most concern to the community. As the city's police chief begins his report, I'm going to pass out a handout that was inadvertently not appropriately annotated in your packet, simply to shade and color, to call out those recommendations in the attachment to your written staff report that represent citations going up by an amount that is more than about 30%. So I'll hand that out and turn the report over to the city's police chief.
Thank you. Good evening once again, and I will be fairly brief as the city manager covered most of what I was going to convey. The California Vehicle Code allows cities to establish fines for parking that are, or for offenses that are identified as infractions, which most parking violations are, whether they're identified by the vehicle code or by municipal code. The code also puts a limit on the amount of a parking fine on most infractions of $100. As the city manager mentioned, the police department does not consider revenue when we conduct any type of enforcement. Our goal in providing parking enforcement is depending on the type of enforcement. For example, for time parking, our goal is to do what the code intends, which is to make sure that there is a regular circulation of parking available within specifically the areas that are identified in time parking, the downtown areas. Another example is street sweeping. Our intent is to deter folks from parking in areas where the street is going to be cleaned as a quality of life measure. The only, as a matter of coincidence, I guess you could call it, Assembly Bill 503 went into effect about 9 days ago on July 1st, and it addresses the collection of parking fines. As some of you may know, and I know from personal experience, if you don't pay your parking fine, when you go to register your vehicle, you're not allowed to register it at the DMV unless you pay your parking fine along with some late charges. That still holds true. However, Assembly Bill 503 provides for a payment plan for those that may be indigent or may want to apply or can't afford to pay their fines in whole. So our vendor, Turbo Data, who manages our parking sites and does so for the entire county, has established a process on developing that payment plan for those who request it. And so it's those who fall into this process have to be notified of the availability of a payment plan, and then they have to request it. Should they request it, the charge by the entity that manages our parking sites is $11 per citation for every citation that a payment plan is requested to pay for. The code allows us, or the bill allows us to recoup approximately $5 of that $11 through the additional fees charged in the late fees. So what this really means is unknown. It just started again about a week and a half ago. We probably won't know the real effects of the fiscal impact to the police. It comes out of the police department budget, but the fiscal impact to the city for another year, because it's going to take that long for vehicles to be re-registered and parking fines attached to that. I can tell you that of the $600,000 in parking revenue that the city typically sees in a year, approximately $190,000 of that revenue comes from individuals who are registering their car and just failed to pay their parking site. So there's a lag time with that. So there's about a third, a little less than a third of the fines are collected via this DMV program where they attach the fine to the registration. So those individuals would be notified of the availability of this payment plan and how many people would take advantage of that, and what the cost to the city is going to be kind of remains a mystery to us all. The recommendations that you see on the spreadsheet, the police department contributed to those, and we considered two things when we did so. One is this new bill and how we're going to recover those costs, not knowing what those costs are going to be. And the second consideration was comparing other local jurisdictions to see where we fell within the range of existing fines in the area. So that's all I really have to add to the report that you have, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
No speaker cards? Okay. Anyone wish to speak on this? Comments, questions from council? Oh, I apologize. I didn't turn all the way. Go on. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Adrian Lopez, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come up here and say something in regards to the possible increase in parking fees. I grew up on the west side of El Camino, and now currently I'm living on the east side of El Camino, so I have a very good idea of the differences in parking availability. And being that I work in the construction field as well, I do have a pretty good understanding of zoning ordinances and the problems that the residents on the east side of El Camino face. I believe that any type of increase in parking violations would greatly affect the residents on that side, due to the fact that when it seems like when that area was constructed, there was no planning division at that time to enforce what type of residential housing units needed to be established there. So within that area, you have duplexes, apartments, homes, and it's very congested, which makes it very difficult for people to find parking in the first place. And there is also another issue where some of the homes are so outdated that the driveways aren't to code, where they are smaller than they should be, and cars can't park in those driveways as well, so they have to park out in the street. Putting into the fact that you have to, your street sweeping once every other week on Wednesdays and Thursdays just makes it very difficult. And I think I see how raising the prices for the tickets can be of a benefit. I believe that I don't think it would solve the issue, and I think more so it wouldn't the residents who that ticket
That's right.
that by raising those ticket prices, the people who live in those areas would be more so, probably more so angry at the fact that they would have to pay those higher prices, and I think it would be more of a negative than a positive. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. Anyone else? Questions or comments from council? Michael?
So the speaker brought up some really good points there, because increasing these fees definitely does impact our residents. It impacts the people in the neighborhood, and a lot of times they're making do with what they have. But it does seem like there is some opportunity here, at least for the things that are safety issues, to take some action that hopefully won't impact the neighbors, at least not the law-abiding people in the neighborhood. I did have a question. Some of the items on this list are municipal code violations, and some are California Vehicle Code violations. And I'm wondering, does the $100 cap apply only to the vehicle code, or does it also apply to the municipal code?
So it applies to anything that's not a misdemeanor. So there are some vehicle code sections listed here that are misdemeanors. For example, there's some registration violations where it's kind of an intentional act. If you put the wrong license plate on a vehicle, that would be a misdemeanor. But the way that the vehicle code reads allows for or provides the $100 cap for any traditional parking citation. So there are some non-parking citations intermingled within our fine schedule.
Okay. Yeah, I did notice that some did exceed the $100. That's why I was wondering why there was a difference. And I noticed some that, well, for example, you mentioned the wrong license plate, but there's also one, it's a separate one for displaying the wrong registration. I'm assuming that's the wrong tag on the plate, and is that considered different, and is there any reason why we didn't raise that one?
So that's basically a fix-it ticket. So that would be a currently registered vehicle that just did not have the current registration tab. Okay. So either somebody took it off or they forgot to put their sticker on. So it's not a registration a violation of registration. It's just that the current sticker is not on the license plate. However, the car is legally registered.
Okay. And yeah, I noticed there's a series of them here that are either red zone, handicap parking. They're only moving up a little bit, but I think those could potentially be considered safety issues. Obviously, if something's been painted red, it's probably because of a line of sight issue, or because it's in front of a hydrant. So I'm wondering why we wouldn't want to raise those up to the maximum. Again, understanding that you've probably been focused on just, cost recovery, not trying to make a profit on this, but I think to be an effective deterrent, you would want the fee to be appropriate to encourage the type of behavior.
Yeah, so the police department doesn't really makes, we took into to account two criteria without making suggestions, kind of giving you an idea of where we sit. And the two criteria were one, the new assembly bill, which we don't know what that impact is going to be, and then two, we did a comparison with other jurisdictions and tried to find some middle ground as to what we saw that was going on in other areas. However, it's completely at the council's discretion to make the necessary adjustments with what the code allows.
Okay. Thank you.
And just as a follow-up, yes, this is staff coming back at some requests for increases, but also it is an opportunity for council to offer and chime in if they feel there are other areas that also eventually need to be addressed, as you're alluding to. Other questions or comments from Irene?
Well, I know that your officers go out and use discretion when they are ticketing people. Thank goodness, because I walked the dog this morning for 2 miles, and in those 2 miles, I was particularly counting people who park their cars behind driveways. So they're totally blocking the driveway, not just 6 inches or whatever. And there was 23 of them in just Linden and back up on Elm, and nobody, I mean, they hadn't been ticketed, but they obviously were the owner's cars, or there was some nexus to the house and the driveway they were blocking. So what do the officers do in that case? They just kind of drive by and ignore it, or how do they determine
for blocking,
who to give a ticket to?
It's illegal to block any driveway if you're parked on the street.
Right.
However, we only respond to complaints of people that are blocking the driveway, because we don't cite individuals who are blocking their own driveway. We realize the strain that there is in parking, and again, our goal is not to go out and write tickets for the sake of writing tickets. We truly want to have a positive impact on the area, and a lot of that is based on complaints. And we don't feel that if you block your own driveway, that you're having that negative impact. So we respond to blocked driveways on a complaint basis, because if we see a car blocked in a driveway and we haven't received a complaint, like anybody else, we like yourself, we assume that that's the resident there, and it's not prohibiting anybody from accessing either the garage or the driveway there.
Okay, great, thank you, because my daughter parks behind my cars all the time, and which allows neighbors to park and actually helps the parking situation, because that's one more car that's not
just
putting
one,
there
which
somewhere.
is a little different than, just a point of clarification, and I know this is a touchy subject, but the short driveways that people pull into and block the sidewalk, that sometimes is another issue. We'll get calls saying, hey, there's cars blocking the sidewalk that may be in driveways, depending on, and unfortunately
Right.
we will go and if we get complaints, we'll go and cite those when we have the personnel to do that. But not typically. We never just randomly cite somebody blocking a driveway unless we get a complaint.
Okay, and then I saw in here something about a hydrant. 15 feet or within a hydrant? I'm sorry, I didn't mark it.
Near the top of the third page.
Oh, thank you. So within 15 feet of a fire hydrant, is that? I didn't know that.
That is technically the law. Yes, you're not supposed to park within 15. And again, we use some discretion there. If the fire department can access the hydrant, and we're confident that they can, our goal is to make sure that the person parking the car is not preventing access to the hydrant, rather than pulling out a tape measure to make sure that you're 15 feet rather than 14 and a half feet
Okay.
from the hydrant.
So this counts even if there's no red curb parked in front?
Technically, that's correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. So, I think most of these that we have, that you've raised them from $38 to $40. I think they're reasonable, and given that most of them are complaint-driven, I don't think they're going to cause undue hardship. I would, however, like to see the red zone one. I believe Councilman Salazar mentioned it too. I think that should be higher, at least $60. People blatantly park there, and it drives me nuts. That's my comment.
Thank you. Marty, anything? Yes. A mic out there.
So, Mr. Lopez, thank you for that perspective. Parking's tough in many places, and we're the permitted parking subcommittee provided their recommendations to staff, and this is one of the things that came out of that, of increasing the fines so that it could be an additional deterrent for people that are parking their vehicles not in the right spot or making it unsafe. And that's the number one thing I'm concerned about. Safety and allowing people that need access to a full sidewalk, those in wheelchairs, those with strollers, those with mobility issues, that they could freely, as the law intends them to walk, to access the sidewalk, whether it's in a wheelchair, to be able to get from one part of town to the other, uninhibited. And that, in my view, while still understanding the sensitivity of those people that do park and block the sidewalk, it's one thing if you're blocking it a little bit, and that's where it's great. This discretion is allowed with our police officers to kind of say, well, that car or that person could kind of get by, but if somebody's blatantly just splashed across the sidewalk from all the way to the curb, that's just super rude, and that behavior shouldn't be tolerated. I'm assuming that if that is viewed by an officer, the worst blatant case is that they would stop and give them a ticket, and that ticket should be, in my opinion, $75. The increasing, if the intent is to change behavior by increasing the fine by $2, that's not going to work. You know, it has to be a bigger bite than that, because what's $2 more today? And compared to the inflation of what the last time it was raised in 2010, you know, inflation is closer to 15% over those years. So $2 is very little. I would recommend that a subcommittee be formed and get back and review this, because there's so many things here. I mean, I looked at this when I got the agenda packet on Friday, and I was like, wow, that's a ton of different things for people to get tickets for. But being able to prioritize, and those that are more causing a hazard to a neighborhood, and you've done that. I think that we could probably get a subcommittee and turn this around a little faster, unless we wanted to talk about it, I don't know, much longer tonight. I'm definitely not in favor of increasing the parking ticket for somebody on street cleaning day. There's so many random things that happen on that Wednesday or Thursday when when I was working here, I got it a couple times just because we weren't paying attention. I haven't gotten one in years, but a friend of ours who took Jeanette to the doctor parked on the other side of the street, and when she got back, she had a ticket, and it was like, You know, who was to think, right? And I've heard, you know, why do you park, or why do we cite on one side of the town and we don't cite on the west side of town, and then increasing the fines on that. It's more or less somebody forgetting than really creating a safety hazard, in my opinion, than somebody blocking the sidewalk, parking in a handicap ramp, parking on the curb return, and doing all the other kind of sneaky things of rubbing out curb marking, tire marks, or chalk marks on their tires. So those are kind of my thoughts. I'd like to see the 72-hour, or maybe this is a question for you, Chief, of when it comes to the 72-hour, so you get a call, car's been there for 72 hours, and then an officer comes out, CSO comes out, I think, and marks the tires, and then 3 days pass, and they come back and check to see if the car's still there, and if it's still there, then they get a ticket and removed, or how can you help me understand what actually happened?
So first, a couple of things. I wanted to clear up one. You mentioned an assumption that unfortunately I cannot corroborate. We do not proactively enforce cars on the sidewalk. We just simply don't have the personnel to do that. The only parking that's proactively enforced in the city is time parking and street sweeping. It's the only posted parking regulation. It's the only it's the most frequent violations, and it's the only violations that we are equipped to proactively enforce. We don't have the staff, nearly the staff, to stop every time we see a car parked on the sidewalk. That's just not feasible. For the 72-hour parking violation, so that code is misunderstood frequently. The 72-hour, the way that the 72-hour code is written, it's written for abandoned vehicles, and it's to prevent people from leaving abandoned vehicles on a roadway. So it's not something that can be proactively enforced. If an officer is driving down the street and a car is parked legally, the officer would have no idea how long the car has been parked there. So we only do that in response to complaints. Our calls for service regarding that area have increased dramatically to the point where they have impacted our other parking enforcement areas. And the frustrating part about that is, it used to be about 13 to 15% of the 72-hour violations had merit, were enforceable. We would end up taking some enforcement action. That's reduced to about 9%. So we get a lot of calls, and we have a whole abandoned vehicle program that is extremely labor intensive, and unfortunately there's a lack of return on that investment because our calls have increased dramatically. But to answer your question, if a car has been determined to have been parked in excess of 72 hours, they get a citation and it gets towed. And then in order for the registered owner to get the car back, they have to come to the police department and obtain a vehicle release authorization at a cost of $85. And then in addition to the $85, they have to go to the tow yard that towed the vehicle. They pay for the tow fees and any storage fees and that's paid directly to the tow company. We set parameters on what they can charge, but it's a significant amount. So in addition to the citation, it's a pretty costly endeavor to get your car back after it's been towed for a 72-hour violation. Unfortunately, we don't. Again, less than 1 in 10 of the complaints we get are actually enforceable, because we see that those are gone in a very short period of time.
Thank you.
Laura, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing a lot of the comments, and I'm sitting here listening, and I was going to originally say, I'd like to increase this, I'd like to increase this, but possibly there is a subcommittee that reviews these details. I mean, I guess when I first looked at this, we haven't reviewed fees since 2010, which is 15 years ago, and some fines increased by $2. And I understand that the original comment that these fees are really to prevent, not to raise funds to the city. And yet, these things are labor intensive, and yet they do cost the time and money of our police officers. I'm not really sure why some fees are up 58%, some are up 5% or increase. I think, for example, street cleaning, I'm in agreement. I lived on the east side, and when I got a ticket, I simply forgot. Not intentional, and it's a frustrating thing. So it's not something I'd like to see increase. But I guess I need to understand better. Maybe it's a bigger discussion. It's not really about fines. How do we address the issue that's occurring in areas such as the east side, in areas such as Mills Park, where residents are driving in the neighborhood, picking up a lift, and moving on. And they're parking their vehicle there for 3-4 days, whatever it might be. I understand that these 72 hours are really based on an abandoned vehicle program. So it's very different from somebody dropped off a car, going to the airport, picking up a BART, and heading off for a number of days. So I'd like to figure out better ways to address it, and I don't think we're going to do that tonight.
Okay, so here's what I've, okay, let's please. Helps.
Thanks. I have one more question, Chief. On the bottom of page 2, it says restricted commercial parking oversize. What does that mean, and what do we do about it? I know we've had a lot of complaints about oversized vehicles, but I believe a lot of those complaints were.
So the two code sections at the bottom there are related. The second to the last addresses the weight restriction of the commercial vehicle over 10,000 pounds.
Is that what that means?
That's what the second to last. That's the second to last line.
You're going to have to translate it. It's X
the
width
very bottom
higher.
Exceeding weight.
Exceeding weight. It's basically a commercial vehicle that exceeds the 10,000 pound weight limit.
Okay.
And the bottom line is a commercial vehicle that exceeds either the length or width limit, the 6.5 feet or 22 feet.
Okay.
So one addresses the weight and one addresses the height and, I'm sorry, not the height, the length and width.
And again, we only respond if there's a complaint?
Oh, no, we'll cite for those. We just don't proactively cite for those. Given the amount of time, we don't have meters in the city, so given the amount of time parking that we have dedicated routes where if you've invested an hour into chalking tires and it's a 2-hour zone, you've kind of committed yourself. It's just a time-consuming process, so it's hard to remove parking enforcement individuals from enforcing time parking to do other things, because if they lose track of their routine, then they all of that work they did to chalk tires and mark cars goes out the window, and then we do actively enforce street sweeping because it's posted and there's an expectation that we do, and we get complaints if we don't.
Okay, thank you.
So I've heard some things as far as the red zone that was mentioned. Marty, there was something you mentioned, $75, and I apologize, I didn't catch it when you were talking. You also mentioned in regards to the street sweeping, no increase at all. I am not for increasing it to the degree, but I think it does deserve to be increased since it hasn't been since 2010, even if it's the $2, 5% or something. And to answer the question of why is it on the east side or west side, for a man who's lived on both sides, but currently resides in Minor Monday, Tuesday on my street for street sweeping, I'm going to go by what Ed Simon said. Irene, you can help me if this history is wrong or he was just telling me this, is that there were folks that came because of the leaves, because of the clogged drains, and wanted to make sure that the debris during the rainy seasons, because of the flooding element, and that wasn't necessary on the west side, but the east side did have that problem, which has been much better since when I was a young man and had to take the shoes and socks, roll up the pants legs coming from elementary school to get to the house in San Antonio. So that's how I used to have to get in when it rained. So I think those are some of the elements for it. And I've always thought just to do it to another side or another area, to invest in the signs and this and that, just because. If it makes sense, if it's good for a neighborhood or the city, then that makes sense. Also, a suggestion was made in regards to having a subcommittee. So what is the council's desire? Is the council prepared to move on the resolution, are we looking that we want to actually not move on anything tonight and have a subcommittee established to go through the particulars and bring it back, which then it could be a yes or no. I think everybody was on the page on a lot of stuff. I think there's just a few areas and looking at other more critical things that were safety concerns.
I would just say I kind of cringe when I hear the word subcommittee, because that usually means it's going to take longer, and we got to
Yes.
wait for people to have time to meet and staff to prepare something for the subcommittee, and then it's got to come back to another meeting. So I think if we have a fair amount of consensus up here, I would like to move forward on some of these, and maybe if a subcommittee does need to happen, it could happen on another iteration of it.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
What if we say that we'll come back by the next council meeting? I mean, it should be pretty short. We could just take, obviously, two of us, and we hammer it out and spend a little bit more time and do it just one time, instead of approving, these and that, and that's all. Just throwing it out there. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Having a subcommittee that's going to go on and on and on. No,
No.
we're going to have a subcommittee. We're going to meet in 2 weeks, and then come back to council, and we'll present it and get it done. And if I need a volunteer for that, I'll do it.
Appreciate that. Thoughts, Army?
I think we hit the ones that have to do with safety, which I think are the most important. I understand your reluctance to not increase the street sweeping ones. However, you got a ticket, you don't forget anymore. I've gotten 2 tickets when I parked at my mother's. I don't forget anymore. People need to do it. And when we have I can't think of what the bill is, but you have to have 0 trash into the storm drains, those street sweeping days are going to be crucial to keep that up and clean as much as possible. So, every car that sits there is going to cause even more trash. So I don't agree with you there. I think it should be $60. And then I think there was a couple that we said should be increased.
It was a red zone, and then Marty, you'd mentioned something at 75.
Blocking the sidewalk.
Oh, blocking sidewalk, thank you.
Okay.
Those are the ones I picked up on. And then there was concern that just the increase of, since 2010, having it just a $2, which is a 5% technically, but for the duration that it's been since anything's been increased.
We can increase it 10% and make it.
So I think there's either
42.
2 options. Either we go back with the subcommittee and it comes back at the next meeting for action, 1. 2, we move on the resolution that we have. We can bring back and fine tune additional ones if we wish. So
Let's hear from Laura.
okay. Good call. Laura, they want to include you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I just understand how you go, street cleaning goes from 38 to 60, but no parking any time a red zone goes from 38 to 40. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I look at this, so I volunteer with Marty to be and look at this and come back to council in the next meeting.
Not you volunteered, I don't know.
No, we'll knock it out. I mean, we'll do it over the phone.
You can
Honestly.
just adjourn the meeting to you guys. What works best for staff?
Are you asking? Let me.
I'm trying to get us
rephrase
to take action one way or the other, so I'm trying to ask what works best for staff.
So if the recommendation by Councilmember Medina, as I understood it, was for the subcommittee to meet soon to deal with the existing information and make your own analysis of it, I don't imagine that there is a significant impact on staff other than to attend the meeting, and we're prepared to do that.
Would that be all right? Sure. Okay. So we'll do an ad hoc committee to meet on the existing staff information. It wouldn't mean, my perception is the committee doesn't need, the ad hoc committee wouldn't need to meet to start asking staff to do 3-4 hours of work, additional research. It's the data we have. So there should be, I'm just clarifying for us
Thank you.
up here.
And that's what I didn't say, that it would not be possible to produce any additional or any significant additional analysis between now and 2 weeks from now.
Okay, so we would use existing staff, 2 council members, ad hoc committee. This item would come back on the July 24th council meeting for in some resolution. So Marty, you volunteered, and I appreciate that. Is there somebody else that would like to volunteer?
I'll volunteer.
And Michael. So time is limited. You can meet right after tonight.
We'll be at Artichoke Joe's at
No,
10:30.
no.
Or anybody wants to join us.
So thank you, staff, and thank you, council, thank you, Laura.